So today's topic is about a subject that you may have heard from, may have read about, or maybe you wonder what it is about. It's a very important subject in Buddhism. It's so important that it's often cited and quoted. So let us talk about this subject for a while, and I will just go through the presentation now. Seems there's a little technical issue here. Just a moment. Yes, I fixed it. Sorry about that. So can you see this? Okay. Yeah. Today we talk about what do we do in a temple, and it's about spiritual friendship. This is about a series that I already talked to you about. So basically, there are three ways, three kind of people in our lives that we might talk about, that we associate with. And from a perspective of spiritual and moral development, we might just begin with this way of distinguishing. First of all, there is the people who are morally and spiritually less far as us, to put it in a polite way. So people who are a little not so long on the spiritual path yet, or people who are still struggling with their moral principles. And those kind of people, the Buddha, he would recommend that we associate with them only for the sake of sympathy and compassion, because it's important that we look at this clearly. So those kind of people may not help us morally and spiritually that much, but we can associate with them out of sympathy and compassion. Then there are those who are morally and spiritually similar to us. Those are people who are our friends and follow us on the same spiritual path. They may practice meditation with us, or they may also practice wanting to listen to the Buddhist teachings or visit Thai temples. We can associate with these kind of people to inspire each other in spiritual conversation. We can associate with these people, with these friends, so we can work together and make things run smoothly in this way. And it's also just a great way to be at ease if we are with those people who we are familiar with and who share the same wisdom with us, and share the same spiritual aims in life. This is a very great thing to have. But the most important kind of friendship that the Buddha talked about, which is the sort of friendship that I'd like to talk about today, is people who are morally and spiritually further than us. And you might call these people Kalyana Mitta. You will notice that there are a number of dashes and dots. Those are just typical for the ancient languages of India when we write them in Western script. But typically, that's just it doesn't make it difficult to pronounce. It just gives a few tips to pronounce. So the dash is a long A, for example. So Kalyanamitta is a good, charming, and nice friend. That is the literal meaning of the word Kalyanamitta. And so those who are morally and spiritually further than us, those are very important to have in our lives. Those who help us to grow on the moral, the meditative, and the wise life. In other words, to help us grow on the spiritual and moral path. And what did the Buddha say about such friendship? First of all, he said it's the first step in the good and spiritual life. It's like the first rays of sunlight when the sun rises. It indicates that a new day has begun. In the same way, when we have a good friend that helps us in our spiritual and moral life, we will be sure that we can make it may grow further and have an example to feel inspired by. Whenever we are struggling and we are not sure how to proceed, we can remember what that person has said to us or what that person would do in this kind of situation. That will just be a thought that already is very inspiring and helpful. So good friendship is the entire spiritual life. That is in quotes here. Where does that quote come from? Well, you can guess that's from the Buddha. And how did this quote come to be? I'm just quitting. I'll come back to this in a moment. Well, there was once a moment which the Buddha, he talked about this story, this anecdote in the Buddhist text, in the ancient Buddhist text. And he said that once his attendant, the bhikkhu or the monk Ananda, he approached him and he said to him, "Venerable sir, this is half of the spiritual life. That is good friendship, good companionship, and good comradeship." So the Venerable Ananda was very polite and very respectful to the Buddha, and sometimes he would not ask a question directly. He would just make a statement, and then the Buddha would respond to that statement. But in fact, it is a sort of question. So then the Buddha, he responded to that. He said to the Venerable Ananda or the Bhikkhu Ananda, he said, "Not so, Ananda, not so. This is the entire spiritual life, Ananda. Good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship. In other words, it's not half of the spiritual life, but it's the entire spiritual life. Everything in the spiritual life consists the very lifeblood of the spiritual life is about good spiritual friendship." And the Venerable Ananda, he thought maybe you could say it's half of the spiritual life. Half of the spiritual life you learn by yourself, and half of it you learn from your good friend or your spiritual mentor. Well, then the Buddha said, but actually that's all the same thing, because everything eventually it traces back to the same source. Even the way you teach yourself, when you really think about it, we have so much to thank our mentor or our spiritual friend for, that we can say that everything we have done and learned is entirely, you can trace it back entirely to our good friend. Now, that is not to say that we do not have our own responsibility. Of course, we do. But good friendship is always part of everything we do on the spiritual and the moral life. Another way to look at it is that we all need to be both have a good spiritual friend and need to be one as well. We need to pass on the good words to the wise people of the next generation, in the words of the Buddha. So we need to know that in his words, that wise people will pass on the good words, will pass on the good message. And so when we think about it, Spiritual mentors or spiritual teachers, for example, in our tradition, we have Luang Pu, the great master of meditation that you have probably heard about a lot already on this channel, or Kunyai, the nun who founded our temple in Thailand. These people, they have taught a lot to us. Or Luang Pa the Machayo, the teacher who is the great meditation master who is alive in the present day to teach us. All of these people have taught us many things, but they do not ask us to pay them something back. They ask us to pass it on, to pass on the good things to the people, to the next generation, to people who are in need of it. Some time ago, when I was still a student, I ran a journal from the university. That journal was about spirituality and religion from different approaches. And I was asked to join the committee or the staff of the journal to have a Buddhist approach because people knew that I was Buddhist. At that time, I was a student, but I already was practicing Buddhism. So at that time, I interviewed an American writer who wrote a book which you may have heard about, Pay It Forward, because the movie that was made based on this book has become quite well known. And in this movie and this book, this writer, this author, she actually tries to convey the idea that when we have been done good to, if people have done good to us, we should not only try to do something back, but also to pay it forward, to do something like a domino effect, to put it into practice and to pass on the good things that we've learned. And sometimes that is the best way we can do something back for our teachers. So that's also another meaning of the entire spiritual life, not just half. The entire spiritual life is good friendship. Why do we need a good friend continually on our path? I mean, there's many people in my daily life as a monk who come to me to learn about meditation. And after a while, they do not come anymore because they have learned everything there is to learn about meditation for the time being. And they think that's okay. We don't need they don't need it anymore. And that's okay. I don't blame anyone here. But it's important to note that when we are practicing ourselves on the spiritual moral path, there is always be challenges. There's always going to be challenges and things that we are overlooking in our lives. Some things that are very important, we think are not important, but some things that are we think are very important are actually, just minor stuff. So the Buddha, he says that if you really want to know if somebody is your good friend, then you should ask yourself, is anyone in our lives who seeing your fault advises you? When they see your fault, do they advise you? Do they dare to step forward and tell you you're making a mistake or you're doing something wrong, you should improve on that? If not, then maybe you ran out of good friends. And a word that he used for this was a person who points out treasure, or in Thai language, chi kum sap. When somebody gives us advice or is a mirror to us, telling us what parts are good about ourselves, but also what parts we should improve on. The Buddha said, regard him, could also be a her, as one who points out treasure, the wise one who, seeing your faults, rebukes you. The word rebukes means simply giving somebody strong advice, especially in moral subjects. So, if you can point at somebody in your life who you know this person will tell me if I'm doing something wrong, in my character or in the way the things I say and think and do, then you should consider yourself a rich man. But if you have two of them, or even three, then you are a millionaire. This is very valuable because you have people pointing out treasure at you all the time. I mean, if you talk about the world, the mundane life, if you use a mundane example, you don't need to have a financial advisor. You've got somebody showing you the greatest treasure, a spiritual friend. So, this is very valuable. If we can find such a person, then that's very good. But if we haven't yet, then we should try to. It doesn't always have to be a teacher, could be, but it can also be a person who we know, simply as I mentioned before, is a little bit spiritually more advanced than us. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. This one. People who are morally and spiritually a little further than us. And now, before we end today's session, I would like to tell a story. Actually, I still have a little bit more to tell because we are not ending yet. But just before we continue, let me put it that way. I'd like to tell you a story which is pretty well known in Buddhism, especially in Southeast and South uh, Asian Buddhism. This is a story about two people, and Jotipala and Gatikara. Okay, I'm going to write a few things for you down on the board. You still all there? You still there with me? If you have any questions, you can always interrupt me, okay? You can interrupt me or ask anything in the chat. If not, then I'm continuing. But I might have a question for you at the end. So we've got two people, right? Jotipala and Katikala. Now, Jotipala, he is he's like a Brahmin. Oh, sorry. He's like a Brahmin or a priest. He's like a person from the high class caste, the high parts of Indian society. So he's an important person. He also thinks of anyone else who's not in the same class or the same caste or the same level as he as inferior. And then there is Katikara. And he is a potter. Potter, we still have them today. I think in Thailand you do, and here also. Is somebody who makes pots. Okay? Somebody who makes pots. And in those days, it was pretty common for potteries, where potters were working, to have like in a workshop with potters, right? There were often monks coming to rest for the day. If there was not a monastery in the area, they would rest in a pottery. This was fairly common. So this potter had become, through time, a very spiritual person through his association with wise people, with people who could point out good things to him. So this potter had found the Buddha of that time. Now, as you may be aware, in Buddhism, there is more than one. Buddha. And at that time, this was a previous period in human history. And in that age, there was another Buddha, not the Buddha as we know now. And at that time, this potter, Gatikara, he was very much appreciative of this Buddha. He had learned so much from him. And he offered his house as often as he could for the Buddha to go to. and he was a very strong supporter. But his friend was completely opposed to the Buddha or to anyone who was a monk. He didn't believe in monks. He didn't believe in nuns, for that matter. He just believed in the priests, the highest class of Indian society. And those monks, they were just, not very important people. They were not really part of the high society that he lived in. And he did not believe that he could find a teacher in such people. So whenever his friend Katikara asked him to come and see the Buddha, he would not go. He would not go. He would just say, well, no, Buddha like that, who shaves his hair and is not even a priest, how can I listen to such a person? What nonsense. And this was always like this. Katikara often tried. But then one day he thought, maybe I haven't done it in the right way. I haven't found the right angle yet. Maybe I just take my friend to do something relaxingly as friends do. So they went to have a bath together, maybe similar to how sometimes business people these days go to a sauna together. And then when they were having a bath in a river, the his friend Brahmin came out of the river, and he was as he was drying himself, he thought the potter Karikara, he thought to himself, well, now is the right time. He's relaxed, he's at ease. We are good friends, enjoying our good friendship. So I can now encourage him to come and join me to see the Buddha. And he will be able to learn a lot. But then the Brahmin again, Jotipala again said, why would I go to see somebody like that? Because he's enlightened, Katikara said. And Jotipala said, do you know it's not so easy to become enlightened? You always talk about it like it's very easy. It is not so easy. It's very difficult to become enlightened. And so these words were very strong. And Katikara knew that if he didn't try harder, then he would never be able to encourage his friend to come and see the Buddha. And this was an important turning point. And he thought to himself, in order to help my friend, I even have to sacrifice my friendship. And then he grabbed the hair of his friend and he said, come and see the Buddha with me, which was very odd for somebody to do, even in the present day, but even more so in those days, because the head in ancient India and also in Thailand is the highest part of the body. You cannot just tap or grasp somebody with on his head. So this was a very serious thing to do. But Katikara thought this is what friendship is about. You have to sacrifice sometimes your friendship to be able to be a good friend. So then Katikara, he he tried to persuade his friend like this. And then you may think, well, why is he so intolerant? Why does he always want to get him to see the Buddha? Maybe some people think like that. But there's a twist in the story. Because then eventually Jotipala, he thought, well, I'm going to see my friend, my friend's teacher. So I'll just, I will not have this trouble anymore. I will just get it over with. But then it turned out that this Buddha very much impressed him. And Jotipala became one of the devotees of the Buddha, and eventually he became a monk himself. He was ordained under this Buddha as a monk. And now it turns out that Katikara could not ordain as a monk, could not be ordained because he had blind parents to teach. I'm sorry, to take care of. So he could not ordain. So eventually Jotipala became a monk, ironically, and Katikada did not. So eventually the Buddha, he told this story to his attendant, and you remember his name, right? The Venerable Ananda. And then he asked the Venerable Ananda, who do you think, who of these two people, and now there's twist in the story, who do you think of these two people who I was? Because one of these two people was I in a previous life. And then the Venerable Ananda, he was not, he had not had the time to answer yet. The Buddha said, do not think that I was the potter. I was the Brahmin in those days. In other words, the Buddha was the one who was, at that time, the Brahmin who did not have faith in the Buddha of those days. So even strangely enough, even the Buddha in a long time ago did not have faith in Buddhism. How is that? That's very strange, isn't it? And why did he tell this story? Because he wanted to tell people that, wanted to tell Venerable Ananda that even he, who Buddhists regard as the most perfect human being, once needed a good friend in a previous life, in his past. And even if you don't believe in previous lives, but still the story shows something. We all are dependent on good friends. And if we do not have a good friend, it's difficult to see the sun, to find the sun rays, and to start a good and moral spiritual life. If I talk about my own life, then I will certainly think that there have been many important spiritual friends in my life. The first important spiritual two people who have been my spiritual friends in my life was Lopi Nicholas, who you may have already met online, who is a teacher in our tradition, who is now located in England, and he often teaches in America. He's mostly located there, actually. And another and even more important for me is the spiritual friend who is now known as Lompi Mapong. Lompi Mapong is in Chiang Mai. I think you may have also seen him online. He teaches a lot as well. He taught me everything from the beginning: how to talk with monks, how to take care and do volunteer work at the temple. And I learned a lot from him about the spiritual and the moral life from both of these people. And if I try to think, what would I be without these two people, is very difficult to think. It's almost impossible to try and think what I would have done, what kind of life I have lived, and how I could find happiness if it weren't for these two people. Of course, there have been many other people in my life who've helped me along the way, but these two I always remember. So maybe you have these kind of people in your life, and if you do not yet, maybe you should find some. Even if it doesn't have to be a monk or a nun, but it could be, but it could also be somebody in your who's close to you and who you know is spiritually somebody you can learn from. So how do we learn from our good friend, from our spiritual good friend? Well, first of all, we have to associate with a good friend. Often meet with this person. We often associate and learn and try to improve. our association with with that person in a respectful way. So if we have somebody at our local Buddhist temple that we like to go to, or our local meditation center, that helps us on the spiritual path, and we know that, then we should try to find time, sacrifice time to associate with that person. We might even have to travel a little farther than is convenient. Convenience is not always helping us to move forward. Most of the time, convenience is the definition of staying in one place. Then, if we often associate with that person, try to look at them and see what good points or what good things they have. You know, Lopi Nicolasi used to say a bit ironically that virtue doesn't come unpackaged. He said that, and with that, it's a bit funny way of saying it, but he said that in order to mean that all the good qualities in life we can learn about and read about, but if we see them in a person, it's much easier to learn. Then, when we are familiar with the good things the person has taught and lived, then we can emulate or try to be like that person in some ways. We don't have to be exactly like them, of course, but we can learn from their good character. So, this is the path of spiritual friendship. And that's the entire reason why spiritual friendship is so important in our lives. We used to have a project in our temple back in the day, and this is a picture taken in Mongolia. And they put a sign on a house where has the sign, it says Kalyanamita house or Kalyanamita home. We used to have a project back in the days, in the 90s, was that late in the 90s, and we encouraged people to set up their own homes as a Kalyanamita home, inviting people to meditate and to do other good things, to listen to a teacher talk about the good and spiritual life. This was an activity that was very popular at the time in Thailand. We had hundred thousands of people participating. And this is an example of how the project also was practiced uh, abroad. So this idea of having a Kalyanamita home is very important. We can think of our home as an opportunity to bring people together. If you ever ask somebody to join you on a Zoom session, that's a very good thing to do. I've often seen people doing that in our Zoom sessions in Holland, where they bring a friend along the Zoom session to join them. Or you can, of course, also persuade somebody to join the Zoom session on in the convenience of their own home. But that's maybe a little bit more difficult because if you do it together, you can explain what's going on a little bit. So this is very important. If we have received any benefit from these teachings at all, it's important that you reflect and think about how can I pass this on. Very often I ask myself whether all the good things that I've learned from my teacher, will I ever be able to pass them on to somebody else? Because there's so much. Uh, and it's not always easy in the places where I live in Northern Europe to find an audience for this. But still, it's something I do and spend a great deal of time on every day. So this is basically a little bit of the things that I'd like to talk about for today's talk about good friendship. So for me, the question that I always would like to ask when I hear about this topic is, who can I think of my good friends at this moment in time? If I make any mistakes in my life, who could still help me forward? Who could inspire me in this place, in this time? it's important to often ask ourselves this, is there anyone who can still advise us? Because if we grow older and presumably more wiser, then people are not so inclined to advise us anymore. So it's important to often think about that. Who can still give us advice, who can still inspire us, and uh, are daring enough to talk about those things that we maybe sometimes may not be may be lacking at. Mm. So these are my thoughts on this topic. I understand that there's no question for today. It must be the
Mm.
holidays today. It must be a holiday feeling. Okay, that has been a nice session together, quite peaceful. And maybe we can meet each other again sometime in the future. We have another of these sessions. And so I'm giving the word back to the presenter of today. And I would like to, yeah, like to rejoice in your good deeds for coming to join this session.